Where's the boundary on who gets to have rights and who doesn't get to have rights? This will always be an issue. That's what's so interesting about rights questions is there's a lot of room for disagreement and there's a lot of room for future development.
You're listening to The Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to Lynn Hunt, author of Inventing Human Rights, A History. This history of human rights was so interesting to me, I was originally going to do a whole episode just talking about this book. But thankfully, Lynn was gracious enough to come on the show and share her insights as a historian. During this episode, we talk about how the new technology of the novel might have inspired the ideas of human rights. We talk about the historical problems that they were trying to solve at the time, which human rights were seen as a potential solution to. We talk about the failures of early human rights movements and what lessons this history might have for modern activists trying to create greater rights for all. Now, here is Lynn Hunt to talk about the history of human rights. First of all, I loved your book, Inventing Human Rights.
Thank you.
First, what got you interested in the history of human rights? Because I think that's a fascinating topic to explore. Was there a particular reason that you were drawn to that subject matter?
Yes, in the sense that I'm a specialist in the history of the French Revolution, but in the course of studying the French Revolution, I became interested, not surprisingly, in women's history, because that was the time I was growing up, just when these things became important in the discipline of history and in the teaching of history. So my first sort of impulse was to figure out why did women not get political rights when so many other groups got political rights? And then that led me actually to the next phase, which was, well, what about those other groups? I mean, why were certain groups included? Actually, a huge number of different groups were included. And what were the debates? And what did people say about it? Why were the French revolutionaries amongst the first to abolish slavery, which they did in 1794, for example? So I got very interested in the sort of debates about rights. So then that got me interested in, well, the next obvious question was, well, what makes people believe there is such a thing as rights? So it was a kind of progression of interests that followed one from the other, but they all sort of made sense together.
That's a really interesting question, and one I'd like to explore with you, because I am familiar with a lot of activists who nowadays, because the concept of human rights has been around a long time, they just sort of assume human rights are this thing that should be obvious to everyone. And, well, of course we have human rights. But as your title implies, human rights were either invented or discovered at one point. So first, I'm curious, do you think that they were discovered, or that there was some sort of this human rights thing that was sort of always there, or invented or created in some way? Because you also talk about how, Jefferson says we hold these truths to be self-evident, but for a lot of people, they're not self-evident. There's something that they have to learn in some way. So I'm curious which of those perspectives you hold. Is this an invention or a discovery?
Well, I suppose that depends in part on where you're coming from. I mean, that is, in the 18th century, people talked about discovery because for them it was the rights have always existed, but somehow we've been prevented from seeing this. And so then it's discovery not in the sense that you're inventing something new. They've actually always been there. But as the French Declaration says, neglect or ignorance of the rights of man has led us not to kind of come forward in a straightforward way about this. So discovery in that sense is very important because the theory of human rights depends upon the idea that they must have always existed because they have to do with being human. So if they only came about at a certain point in time, then they couldn't possibly be universal. They couldn't possibly be eternal. They couldn't possibly be something that was justified just by being a human being. So interestingly, the theory, in a sense, required that there always be rights. And we just didn't really understand that that was true.
I'd like to get into the question of how it is that people made this discovery, because as you said in the Declaration, there's an implication that they've been repressed for a very long time for people in that particular moment in time to suddenly become aware of them. So how is it that you think that human rights were discovered? What caused people to suddenly become aware of them as a new idea?
Yeah, so that's of course the one of the really key interesting questions. So there had always been a notion of rights, but not human rights. So rights were what you could do given the legal situation of whatever culture or country you found yourself in. So it's not that the idea of rights was so new, although there's an argument about that, about how much emphasis there really was on rights as opposed to obligations or duties in other ways of thinking about this question. So it's not that rights didn't exist, but it's the idea that everyone has them. So you could say that in
Hmm.
all previous societies, there were rights in some sense of the word, but they weren't the same for everyone. That's the really big issue. So that's why, for me, what was so key was the notion of equality of rights. That is, that everyone has the same rights. Now, of course, when Jefferson said this in the Declaration of 1776, and he said they were self evident, he really meant they were self evident for autonomous, mainly white, mainly property owning men, but he wanted to make a much more general statement so that there could be no kind of, well, he didn't want to say, well, these people have these kinds of rights and these people have these kinds of rights, and then we have a whole set of gradations. That would not be a very powerful rhetorical statement. Instead, he wanted to make the argument that this is something that exists basically for all men. Now, he probably meant the male sex, but he did say all men at a time when mankind, meant all humans. So this is why people have come back to the Declaration again and again to say, well, you didn't really achieve the goals laid out in the Declaration because you said all men are created equal. You didn't say some men are created equal. So this is why, see, this is, to me, you could either say glass half full or glass half empty here, and I'm obviously the half full type of person who says what's really striking here is that he lays this out, and therefore it gives people the possibility of saying you haven't really realized the promise of this declaration. You could talk about the limitations of it, but for me, what's much more interesting is that it opens the door to people saying, how can you say this and not mean it? How can you have
That
slavery if all men are created equal?
that was something I found really interesting in your book, was that, I've heard that criticism before of, oh, well, why didn't they take this concept of human rights immediately to its obvious natural conclusion? But at the time, they were having debates about, well, maybe we shouldn't torture people to death for being Protestant. And to go from that to, the concept of equality for everyone, regardless of gender or race, is a really huge cultural leap. So I'm curious how you think that initial seed was planted, this idea of all men are created equal. And it sounds like it was initially an attempt to get rights, at least for all white men from a certain background, but how they created a concept that eventually led to, well, maybe we should have rights for everyone, and everyone in the truest sense of the word everyone.
Right. And so that's what's so, that's why I'm fascinated by the end of the 18th century, the American and the French revolutions, because when you get to the French Revolution, when this idea has been percolating enough because of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, which is well known in France, that you actually get people saying, if we believe in the rights of man, which is what they called them in the 18th century, the rights of man, by which they meant human rights. If we believe in the rights of man, then we can't have slavery. And some people were willing to say, then women should have rights too. Then people who don't have property should have rights. Then what is the limitation? And by the end of the 18th century in the French Revolution, women don't get rights, but religious minorities get rights. Slavery is abolished. Mixed race people get rights. There are actually, and there are no property requirements at a certain point in the 1790s. So they really push this very far, which my view is couldn't have happened if you didn't get this kind of framework laid out that gets people thinking, well, if that's what is going to be the foundation of government in the future, that is equal rights for everyone, then don't we have to push the boundaries further than we pushed them before, so that by the end of the 18th century, at least in the most radical constitution of the French Revolution, other than women, all men are getting rights except servants, domestic servants, who are seen as not independent. But so this is so fascinating, because then it lays out the lines of conflict that will be true in all Western governments for the 19th century, and in fact, most of the 20th century, of who is going to have these rights. Women, of course, for the most part, don't get rights in any of the Western countries until the 20th century. Keeping in mind, Native Americans did not have the right to vote in the United States of America until the 1920s. So this was an ongoing issue all the way through the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think that's what's so interesting about the concept of human rights, is that it makes this argument possible.
One of the things I found really fascinating in your book was the idea that the initial seed for human rights might have begun because of this new artistic technological innovation called the novel. And that just hearing stories about people from different backgrounds, from different perspectives, actually gave people the ability to have empathy for them and think, oh, like maybe this person thinks and feels like I do and deserves the same things that I have. So I'd like to know more about how it is that the novel, or if you think that was the key to it, or if that was just part of it, but how the novel might have contributed to these early ideas. Because I think most people don't think of the novel as a new artistic innovation now. It's sort of like, well, we've always had books, but we actually haven't in their current form. So how did that help in the creation?
Yeah, I mean, there's
of
certainly
human
always
rights?
been books, and one could argue, there's a big argument about this. One could argue that the novel has existed almost since the invention of writing. Okay, so that's a possible line of argument. I was interested in the fact that human rights sort of comes in and gets a kind of hold on people starting in the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s. And that happens to be the time when what is called the epistolary novel, that is a novel based on the exchange of letters between major characters, is at its absolute height. So I had a big question in mind at first. The first question was, clearly people didn't get converted, as it were, to the idea of human rights because they read tracts about human rights. Because in fact, the notion of human rights is not very clearly developed until you get to 1776 with the statement of the Declaration of Independence and some of the state constitutions in the United States, and then especially in the French Revolution, when they announce that this is a universal principle that is applicable to all countries in the world. Well, this doesn't happen, I would argue, because people read tracts saying this is how we should think about it. They're developing it actually quite piecemeal. And the bigger question is, Why do people believe it? Why do people believe that it is possible to imagine that everyone is equal, has equal rights? This is so contrary to the way the world had been organized, which basically everywhere was traditional, based on deference to your superiors. Most people had some form of kingship or emperorship, in which the ruler is seen as completely different, possibly not even human in the same way as other humans, in which aristocracies were seen as almost racially different from the lower classes, in which the idea that certain people are destined to rule and other people are destined to be ruled was really deeply rooted. So the idea that government should be based on the whole people, the sovereignty of the nation, the sovereignty of the people, is itself an incredibly breakthrough idea. And so what I was interested in is, well, what can explain that people learn to imagine equality? And to me, the epistolary novel was extremely important because it was a kind of, as you had exactly the right word, it was a technology. It was a way of linking people together in a way that they had not been linked together. These appeared in serial installments often. People eagerly awaited the next installment. It's a little bit like they didn't have binge reading in the same way that we have binge watching on our streaming services, but it was like in the old days of television, you couldn't wait for the next episode of Masterpiece Theater, Downton Abbey, I Claudius, whatever. Uh, this is the way the novel worked, which was that people were so invested in the characters. They had to know what was going to happen next. They would literally write letters to the author saying, I just am overwhelmed by this book. Or they could see a bad outcome coming and they would write saying, please, please, please don't have Clarissa die at the end. Can't she end up happy the way she should in this kind of story? So I was struck by the fact that this technology of producing a novel which is about ordinary people. It's now no longer about aristocrats, which is what most of the theater and much novel writing had been about in the past. Now it's about ordinary people who would be people you would never, of course, know personally, but you are learning to have feelings about these unknown people. To me, this was a crucial part of explaining why people could imagine that an ordinary servant girl, like Pamela in Richardson's novel of that name, could be interesting, could have her own thoughts, could conceivably be seen as equal to the men in the society in which she was living. Now, Pamela isn't agitating for human rights. She isn't agitating for political participation. None of those things are happening, but she is a real person. She, as a servant, as someone from the lower classes, is someone you care about because Richardson, the novelist, just is unbelievably successful at making you care about her. So much so that I love these stories that when she finally gets married towards the end of the novel to her employer who's been trying to seduce her all along, and he's finally convinced of her virtue and can't resist her any longer, and he's an aristocrat. People everywhere were ecstatic that they were getting married. And there was a kind of way in which it was so real. It was almost realer than their own lives. And we know that that's certainly what happens with media today, of various different sorts. So I just thought this, you had to be able to explain the broader resonance of human rights and not just the intellectuals who might be interested in the question.
I'm curious if there's any storytelling lessons from these early novels for people who might want to tell stories now that also help increase empathy and encourage others to see people from different backgrounds as their equals. Because I think that strategy of telling stories about people you want others to empathize with has been used by modern movements too. I'm thinking of, for example, in the 90s, there was a big push by GLAAD, the gay and lesbian organization, to get better gay and lesbian representation in stories and film. And, 10, 20 years later, there's a huge push for gay rights, and gay marriage becomes normalized and also becomes legal. So I'm curious, for storytellers who want to increase empathy, are there any things that they can learn from these early novels that might add to the concept of equality and human rights in future stories?
Well, I think, Brendan, I think you've just laid it out perfectly, which is that we see in our own time how television in particular, because it's something that almost everyone has access to, but I suppose also one could say the movies also play this role to some extent, that the storytelling media that are the most important in our time have an incredibly important influence on the way people view other people, which is why it's not irrelevant that there's been such a struggle about who's going to be in the Academy of Motion Pictures decision group, which has always been quite large but has been very white and majority male for a very long time, and that why there was enormous pressure about that to bring more attention to films that are made by women, that are made by various minority groups. It was a very big deal when the movie Parasite won Best Picture, and it was a movie done by a South Korean that brought a kind of slice of South Korean life to people all over the world who would not have had really any ideas about this in the past. So I do think this is incredibly important, and not just for gay rights, which is a kind of striking example because there's such a change from total rejection to majority acceptance in a relatively short period of time. And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm interested in. I'm just fascinated by the fact that people can go from, no, that's inconceivable, to, yes, that's conceivable in a very short period of time. And it can't be because they've read something, a tract that convinced them of this. It has to have a deeper resonance than that. But it's not just about gays. It's certainly about the question of African Americans in U.S. society and all kinds of minority groups in all kinds of different settings. I'm struck, for example, I've been watching on one of the streaming services, Shtichel, which is a series about Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. Now, I'm not Jewish. I don't think I know very many ultra-Orthodox Jews. I may not even know any, since I usually come in contact with people who are more secular. They're conservative, they're liberal, but they're not, or they're even Orthodox, but they're not ultra-Orthodox. Well, this series, all over the people watching it all over the world, and it's given them a kind of, and certainly myself, I find it absolutely absorbing, and I'm now more sympathetic to what the choices are that you make if you want to be an Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jew, in this case in Israel, or anywhere else for that matter. Whereas before, I would have probably thought of them as strange because they dress differently, they have completely different cultural expectations, familial expectations, and the series has had an enormous impact in making people interested in the inner lives of people in that community, which means then you recognize, actually, they're like me. They're not as different as I thought they were. So that's where the empathy comes in that I think that's so interesting. It allows you to say, oh, that person or these people, this community, they actually share many things with me that I didn't realize before. And that, I think this is just it's so interesting how that happens, and I think it's incredibly important.
The other thing I want to ask about is the things that the early people talking about human rights were reacting against. So the other thing that you talk about in the second chapter is the torture methods that were used at the time. There's a very graphic description that Voltaire talks about the, I might mispronounce this name, but Jean Callis case, and how, I think people nowadays have certain assumptions about human rights and equality being normal, and that many of the judicial and torture methods that existed in prior history are not known to people now. So do you think also that, people are having this newfound empathy because of the stories they're reading? What about the other things that they're reacting against that might make them think, like the opposite pressure that means that they need to change?
Well, there's two different ways of looking at this. I mean, the torture question for me was another example, really fascinating example of how fast, excuse me, how fast opinion can change. Because in the question of torture was kind of normalized in much of Western Europe and the United States until quite late in the 18th century. And then opinion changes again so fast. So one of the things I was talking about in the book, you mentioned Voltaire and his interest in this case in southern France. Well, Voltaire, a few years before, is not that interested in the torture question, and even at the beginning of his involvement in this affair, he's more upset about the fact that it reveals bigotry and prejudice against Protestants than he is about the torture that's applied. But then, only a couple of years later, he's announcing that everyone agrees that torture is a bad idea. So there's a way in which people's opinions are changing very quickly in the 1760s and the 1770s. And this seems to be going on all over Western Europe and Britain, to a certain extent in the United States. In the United States, one of the things that's really interesting is there's a kind of movement against brutal punishment, except for slaves. Except in the area, especially in the slave states, but not just in the slave states, where, in other words, slaves can be treated differently because they are seen as not fully human in the same way right away. So torture is a fascinating question from that point of view. But then you also raised the issue of the present. So now we're in a very interesting situation now, because as we know, torture was used in the various dark prisons of the war on terror after 9/11, and it was also probably used in Guantanamo Bay, and this was a huge issue when it came up. It is not being used now, but it was used extensively in the early 2000s and even the 2010s. But what was interesting about that debate, in my mind, was, well, first of all, it brought back the issue about torture, which of course was justified on the grounds that it was the only way to protect the nation. So the nation took priority over the individual rights of the terrorists, who lost their rights by engaging in the activities in which they engaged. But at the same time, there was an enormous amount of criticism of the use of torture, precisely because it went against this development that had gone on for generations, if not centuries, to try to eliminate torture from the judicial process and from political activities. After all, we condemn, if the Chinese are using torture against dissidents or the Russians are using torture against dissidents, we would decry this. We would say this is a very, very bad idea. So the torture issue that's the second side. This is interesting because there's been a certain pushback on that, arguing there are things that take priority over individual rights in a time of a crisis. But I think this is that's a dangerous road to go down. And I think, frankly, the argument against torture is in some ways the argument that the judges also came to in the 18th century, which was that confessions extracted by torture actually weren't reliable. Because some people, and one of the big arguments against torture in the 18th century was that torture could not give reliable evidence, because weak people would give in and say, yes, I did it, because they wanted the torture to end. And strong people would never give in, and therefore people were being let go because they were stronger physically, and other people were being put to death because they were weaker physically. And so there was a kind of undermining of the evidence that was given by torture. And I think that is still one of the issues that people still would say, yes, you claim it's going to save the nation, but what leads you to think that people are going to tell you the truth in this situation?
It's funny that you mentioned that this question was resolved nearly 200 years ago, because one of the other pieces of history that fascinates me is it might have also been resolved during the Spanish Inquisition. So there's a famous reformer, Alfonso de Salazar, who was known as the witch's advocate, who said, hey, just because you tortured someone and they said the devil talked to them doesn't mean the devil actually talked to them. And you need to get some material evidence for this if you're going to prosecute on those grounds. So it seems like one of those basic human questions that people keep coming back to and having to relearn the obvious answer to. And one of the things,
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know if you have any comment
an
on that.
extremely interesting parallel.
How is it that then, because these issues keep coming up in human history, how is it that the early people talking about human rights were able to enact their agenda politically? Because, there might be, just as there's some parallels with the problems, I'm wondering if there's some parallels with the solutions, the things that they actually tried that changed the way that people thought or got political reform.
Well, in the 18th century, I think it's a bit different from today, because today there's a much greater kind of sense of the availability of talking about rights. I mean, it's a widely known phenomenon. So when you say human rights, people know what you're talking about. So activism in that sense can take a very different form. Whereas in the 18th century, it was something that it was interesting, because people in the 18th century don't write tracts about human rights per se. They write things about torture and cruel punishment and why it's not appropriate to do that. So there are reform movements around specific things like that. The rights question becomes much more available to people when there's the issue of a new form of government. So the American Revolution is obviously very important, because the revolutionaries decide with the Declaration of Independence that it's not enough to say we've got grievances with the way George III is treating us. They want to have another foundation. So they don't feel, and they're quite right in saying, it's not just that we want to be independent, we need to have a kind of argument for why our independence is going to be based on a new foundation. It's going to be based on government by the people rather than a traditional form of government. So it's a complete break with the past. And so the American Revolution is incredibly influential in ways that people didn't really understand in some ways until much later. It's incredibly influential because it shows that you can decide to form a new government and to base it on new principles. So that gets the conversation about rights going in a much more active fashion. And then the French Revolution, by announcing from the beginning in August 1789 that the principle of all governments everywhere should be the guarantee of rights, that opens, makes this a much more wide-ranging conversation, because the Americans, of course, see themselves as being in a very specific situation. They are a colony of Great Britain, and their situation is really completely unique to them. The French say, that's great, that's an example for us, but now we're going to give an example to the world by making this announcement. And because of the French Revolutionary Wars, and because the armies are going everywhere, and because there's so much conflict and upheaval going on about this, everybody is getting some sense of the kinds of arguments that are being made, which does not mean that human rights take root at the end of the 18th century, because they don't. They don't really become a sort of universal topic of conversation until after World War II, which revives the 18th century forms, changes them to make them more acceptable in what will become a decolonizing world. And that it really takes off after 1945, and all the way through the end of the 20th century. There's more and more attention given to human rights. But it really takes a very different form in the present from the one it did at the end of the 18th century. And in some ways, I don't want to say it's easy to be a human rights activist now, because that's not at all what I mean. But I mean that language is more available than it ever was before. And so activists can really, when they say human rights, they have a pretty good idea that people know what they're talking about.
I'm curious, you mentioned that the American revolutionaries wanted to distinguish their revolution as being about more than simply, we don't like the king is bad. How much of the adoption of human rights language do you think was a political decision because it was useful to the revolution? And how much of it do you think it was an ideological decision where they were genuine believers in this concept of human rights and felt, hey, we have an opportunity here to actually put these ideas in action?
Well, I think it varied enormously depending on which, one of the American revolutionaries you were talking about. It was certainly not a universal position amongst the revolutionaries, keeping in mind that when the Constitution is developed in response to the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution it makes no real rights arguments until the adoption of the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And it's called that for a reason. It's not called that actually in the Constitution, but it's then referred to as the Bill of Rights on the grounds that there should have been some rights. But the original framing of the Constitution really downplayed the notion of rights and was much more about how this is a government based on the will of the people. We, the people of the United States, is the beginning of the Constitution for a reason, which means not tradition, but the sovereignty of the people, the sovereignty of this new nation that remained to be created, because there wasn't really an American nation at the time of the writing of the Constitution. So there's an enormous variation. I think Jefferson did believe in human rights. I think Madison definitely believed in human rights. The Virginia people tended to be big believers in rights. So it depended a lot on where you were. And of course, it depended in part on how much slavery was an issue in your state. And so it was less of an issue in the northern states, of course, than the southern states, though it was not a non-issue anywhere. So I think there was a great variety of opinion about that. There was certainly a great variety of opinion amongst the French revolutionaries. There was a lot of resistance to having a Declaration of Rights without a declaration of duties. There was a lot of resistance to the idea that government was going to be based on this notion instead of on the divine right of kingship, because they didn't get rid of the king right away. So this was there's always been a lot of contest and conflict about what role rights should play. And we have to say that's true today. The Chinese, I'm sure, would say to you, well, individual rights, that's great, but it's much more important to defend the nation and develop a strong nation and have a strong government and have law and order and have economic development and have public health than it is to defend the individual rights of the population. So there's still a great diversity of opinion. There's a great diversity of opinion in the United States, for that matter. There are some people who don't like the expansion of rights. And there are, of course, great issues that remain. Do fetuses have rights in the abortion debate? Do undocumented immigrants have rights who are living in the country? What gives them rights? Do they get rights if they serve in the army? Do they get rights if they pay taxes? Uh, where's the boundary on who gets to have rights and who doesn't get to have rights? This will always be an issue, because even if we agreed about all those things, we would disagree about whether animals have rights that should be protected by the human, that the humans have duties to animals, or do animals have rights? This will be a big issue in the future, I feel certain. So that's what's so interesting about rights questions, is there's a lot of room for disagreement, and there's a lot of room, and what is so interesting, there's a lot of room for future development.
I certainly agree with that, that there's an ongoing expansion of human rights that's possible. And I'm curious, what what do you think creates success for the people who are trying to further the concept of human rights? Are there any lessons from the history that could guide, people who are interested in expanding those rights or working on them in the future? What actually has seemed to work on this?
Well, you brought this up before, and I think this is a tremendously interesting question. And I think the word you used is exactly the right word, which is storytelling. That is, I think human rights activists have been most successful when they, for example, these are incredibly brave people, where they go to places where there's a lot of conflict, and they tell us this. They tell us the stories, but they also get the people involved to tell us their stories, and this is very powerful, to have the stories of people in situations where their rights are being disregarded, trampled upon, oppressed, abrogated, however you want to see it. If we don't know the story of this happening, then we don't have feelings about it, and then it's very hard to get people involved. Now, storytelling doesn't mean that it's novels, obviously, now, though it can actually still take that form, and novels still play a very important role in getting us more interested and more familiar with the plights of people in other places. But there are all kinds of other forms of storytelling that are very important: newspaper reporting, memoirs, documentary films, fiction films. All of them have played an important role and can play an important role in these issues. The participation of celebrities in campaigns about particular people. Back when I was young, Bangladesh was a huge issue, and it was people like Joan Baez and other people who got involved in these causes that sort of brought it to a wider public and greater attention. So I think that the storytelling part is absolutely crucial. And now it's much more directly about the rights. Whereas in the 18th century, the novel that I was talking about was just about ordinary people. It wasn't about well, yes, it was. It was about ordinary people whose autonomy was being infringed upon. It wasn't cast in terms of rights, because this wasn't a broad enough language at the time, but it was certainly about the limitations on people's autonomy, and what this meant, and why it was problematic, that it got people interested in what people were like and how this related to the question in the end.
There's a big challenge that I am thinking about around the issue of storytelling for certain groups, which is that a lot of the people and groups you might want to expand rights to are not able to tell their own stories. And so, for example, you mentioned animal rights as one potential thing that might come up in the future. Obviously, the challenge there is that animals cannot tell their own stories. And I'm also very interested in children's rights. Again, children don't have the ability to go out and shoot a movie about what's happening to them. So I'm curious how you would handle that. And it sounds like too, I remember reading in your book that the pushback that comes against human rights is basically various groups saying, well, actually, we're not all the same. And so that's when, scientific racism gets introduced, and the idea that somehow different groups of people are actually genetically different in ways that make it such that they don't, according to these people, that they don't deserve equal rights. And there's all these other sort of theories that come out that say, from groups that want to maintain these differences, that want to work against the concept of human rights, that say like, well, actually, we're different. And I guess I see that challenge too when you talk about things like, the rights for children or rights for animals, because on some level, like, children are different and animals are different. But I'm curious how you sort of solve the problem of differences from a storytelling level, and how people push back against the people in history who said, well, we're different, and so somehow that means that it's okay for me to engage in these human rights abuses.
Right, right. Well, that last point, using difference as a justification for not allowing certain groups to have rights, it certainly is still very much with us today. So it remains a live question. So, but that again, this is one of the things I think is so fascinating about human rights, is how you push through one boundary, let's say women's rights, and you encounter another boundary, and then it's the rights of religious minorities, or it's the rights of gay people, or it's the rights of immigrants, and then children is a perfect example of this. Obviously, you're quite right that children are not in a position to kind of like organize their own representation. However, we are very affected by the stories of what happens to children. So there's no question that we identify with children, partly because we've all been one at some point, but also it's fascinating that we have still fascinating debates about where the boundary should be. So we've moved back the boundary, for example, on voting in most instances. There used to be, you could only be an adult when you were 21, but for certain things, being an adult is 18. For other things, being an adult is 16. For other things, being an adult is 14. There's the issue of punishment. Whether you can be tried as an adult, what age you can be to be tried as an adult if you've done something bad. So we have very, very interesting debates about that. But the fact that children are not autonomous in the same sense as we say that adults are autonomous doesn't mean that they don't have rights. That's the same thing about animals, although it's a more extreme case with animals because they can't even speak in a sense to us. But I don't think we would say that children don't have rights. I think we would say that there are certain kinds of rights that they don't have. They don't necessarily have, at a certain age, they don't have political rights. They don't have the right to drive. They don't have the right, there are various things, they don't have the right to decide on everything for themselves. But this is very fluid. That's what's so interesting. So, for example, there is a big issue now about children, very young people who want to change their gender, who see themselves as trans and want to have an operation to change their sort of biological identification. And this is very interesting because there's huge debates going on in many states about at what age a child should be able to say, this is what I want to do. That it has to do with the autonomy question, but it also has to do with it's kind of rights and autonomy that are kind of they don't always work together. And there's an issue of how should we adjudicate that? And I think it's a very important, and it's not an obvious issue of how to resolve it. So, and similarly, this would be true with animals, where I think most people are not vegetarians, and so they believe it's okay to eat animals. But there's the issue of how animals should be treated that you're going to eat. And I think that is something, again, where we see that reporting has a very big impact. I mean, if you read a book or an article about slaughterhouses and you're horrified, you're more likely to become a vegetarian than if you haven't been exposed to this information or don't want to be exposed to this information. So this is an always evolving situation. That's precisely what's so interesting about it. So, and the pushback, so difference. It's so right of you to raise that question. The fact is, it's extremely difficult to live in the societies that we live in now, in which there's supposed to be equality of rights, and in which the government is based on the will of the people. Well, this is, it is so much easier, and this is why many European countries still have at least figurehead monarchs. It's a lot easier if you have somebody who you think is superior, who's sort of in charge, than it is to be in a situation where there's constant alternation in government, in which elections can produce something completely different, and in which some portion of the population is always going to be unhappy because their party hasn't won the election, and they don't like the kinds of things that the current regime stands for. Legitimacy in democratic governments is not easy to establish, which is one reason why Americans have always placed such a great emphasis on the Constitution as being what keeps us going, because it's very hard to live with the possibility of constant change. It's much easier to know what to expect. The problem is that a society in which everyone knows what to expect usually means that no one gets to do anything differently from what they're currently doing. And we believe that people should have the right to improve themselves, to change themselves, to get into a better situation, to do what they want to do. And that implies a different kind of attitude towards people and towards the nature of society. But I think we've come to realize, as we've seen the governments of Eastern Europe, for example, go from being under the control of the Soviets to having their own internally constituted governments, and we've seen how attractive authoritarianism is in many of these instances. It's because it's very hard for people to live with the idea that it's totally up to you and, it could all change in another year or two. It's easier to have somebody say, I know what's going to be best.
That's interesting. It almost sounds like in this framing that authoritarianism is a rejection of responsibility. In other words, if you say, well, we the people, we have rights, we're in charge. Well, if something goes wrong, that means you were in charge when it happened. And so it's a lot easier to just say, that guy's in charge, the monarch is in charge, the dictator, and now I don't have to worry about it.
Right. Well, participation, a participatory government is very demanding. It means that people, have to vote, and they have to think, and they have to read, and they have to consider, and they have to go through all these various things, and it's time consuming, and also you won't necessarily get what you want. And that is very hard.
That's the next thing I was going to ask about, was the revolutions based in equality that, I don't know if you'd say they use a different discourse than human rights, but they claim to be based in equality. So, for example, the Marxist revolution in Russia in 1917 is an example of people using a discourse of saying, well, we're here for equality and we're here for something that sounds a lot like the human rights concept, but is obviously very different. So I'm curious how you would, it almost seems like there's a divergence where there's some people who say, well, we're not all the same, and that justifies all these other sort of, things like scientific racism. And then another group that says, not only are we the same, but we actually deserve complete equality, which can only be achieved through this radical redistribution of power and wealth. So I'm curious what you make of that other direction and how things like the various Marxist revolutions that occurred in the 1900s, is there a line from them from the human rights movement to them, or are they sort of something different?
Well, Marxism in general and Marxist movements almost universally took the position that the equality of political rights is not enough, that it perpetuates certain elites in power. The right to vote is it's a kind of symbolic act that doesn't have any real consequences. So the way to think about it, I think, is that Marxists to emphasize the equality of conditions over the equality of rights. So the equality of rights says you have to set up a situation where everyone has an opportunity to find a better life. And equality of conditions says that's not what matters. What matters is that people you aren't going to be able to do anything unless you have an equality of conditions. So you need to level the playing field in a much realer sense. So I think in that sense, Marxism has always been suspicious of rights talk, and thinks of it as something that just keeps the middle classes or the upper classes in power by giving people the illusion that they are participating in government when in fact money talks still. And this, of course, this is a very good criticism of the situation that we find ourselves in right now, and that what really matters is to change the distribution of wealth instead.
That's an interesting criticism or deconstruction. It sounds like that might have come in part from the failure of certain human rights revolutions. So I'm thinking, of course, of the most obvious one, the French Revolution, which ended with Napoleon. Do you think that there was a degree to which that result helped create the later possibility of people to say, well, actually, maybe we need more than human rights? Or at what point did people start saying maybe we need more than human rights? Was that something that happened immediately after, or was there a sort of a progression to that?
Well, there was a progression. But it's really in reaction. It is in reaction to the French Revolution that it's the people before Marx are already, the early socialists are already saying really what matters is the distribution of wealth and to make production and consumption more equal, and not to focus just on the political structure. But there's a kind of ongoing argument about that all the way through the 19th and really the 20th centuries about which things matter most and how to achieve them. So now we're in a period where there's much more hostility to any socialist or communist idea and to any redistribution of wealth. Keeping in mind that there was no income tax in the United States, I think, until 1916, in the midst of World War I, when there was a desperate need for more income. Many people opposed income tax as being a form of socialism, of redistribution of wealth, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. So this remains an issue. So it does arise in the wake of the French Revolution, but it doesn't happen right away, because Napoleon doesn't believe in human rights at all, and he has no interest in it. There are no declarations of rights in his various constitutions. He believes the power should come from above and obedience should come from below, and that he would provide equal rights in the sense of the law is the same for everybody, but there are no rights to political participation necessarily. The elites get to participate in politics, but not everybody. So Napoleon is hostile to the notion of rights. And of course, the restored monarchs after the fall of Napoleon are also pretty hostile to the notion of rights, but they're having to recognize them to some extent. So already beginning in the 1820s and the 1830s, you have more and more constitutions appearing in different countries, and constitutions always have some kind of guarantee of rights, if it's only equality under the law, that the law should be the same for everyone. So there's a kind of a steady development, I would say, of rights in constitutionalism in the 19th century and in the 20th century. But there's an ongoing argument about whether individual rights matter, or distribution of wealth matters, or law and order matters above all else.
To what? One of the things that you talk about in your book is the sort of, I don't know if you'd say perceived failure of human rights, the fact that many of the various revolutions to achieve human rights didn't initially achieve their ends, or in the case of the French Revolution, kind of resulted in the opposite of with Napoleon declaring himself emperor. To what degree, like, what was the outcome of these sort of perceived failures or initial failures on the history of human rights and what followed after? Was it, how is it that we went from that to the concept still having some sort of enduring power?
Well, human rights are an aspiration. They're an ideal. And so in some sense, all real life situations are going to be a failure in some way of human rights, because there's no, it's equality is still something we have to achieve. We have certainly not achieved it yet. But the great thing about human rights as a concept, in my view, is that it gives you a benchmark. It gives you a way to argue about the way things should be. And so, yes, we are going to always say, well, what about the, we haven't resolved the issue of, do undocumented people in this country have any rights, or don't they? And obviously people feel they have the right not to be treated horribly, but there's a big difference of opinion about whether they should be given rights or not be given rights. And so it's always going to be aspirational in some sense, because let's face it, we're never going to be in a situation in which there are just completely open borders between all countries in the world. No one is going to agree to accept anybody who wants to come live in their country. It's just not the way the world works right now. But actually, we do accept, almost all countries, not everyone, but almost all countries accept the immigration of some people. So the question is we will always be adjudicating these issues.
Is there anything else that you want to add before we finish? Anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd want to talk about, or that I maybe should have asked you about?
No, your questions have been fantastic, Brendon. I mean, I'm impressed. I'm deeply impressed with the sort of way you've thought these issues through, since, I know it's not the only thing you're thinking about with your time. So I'm very grateful for the kinds of questions that you've asked.
Well, thank you. Your book is fantastic. I encourage people to check it out. Inventing Human Rights, A History by Lynn Hunt. Yeah, thanks again for coming on. Thank you for listening to the Brendon Marotta Show. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone else who would also like it, and then go on whatever platform you listen to the show on and leave a positive review. If you want to support the show directly, go to brendonmarotta.com/show and subscribe there. Paid subscribers get special unreleased bonus material and live events that are only available to them. Once again, that is brendonmarotta.com/show. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all later.